All right, everybody, welcome back. Today is our last set of notes for this week on the 1980s, and today's discussion is going to focus on what this week's assignment is about, which is music during the 1980s. So, the music in the 1980s, it's a very interesting decade for music because there's a lot of different stuff. Um, it's kind of the first decade, at least in regards to modern, like current times, where there's a lot of acts from the 80s that are still performing today, unlike the 70s and 60s, where those groups are older and older, so they're not as prominent as they once were. So there's still a lot of groups from the 80s that are still actively performing today, and a lot of them putting out pretty consistently new stuff, new music. Uh, it's an interesting decade in the sense that um, it's kind of a love or hate decade for a lot of people. A lot of people think the music in the 80s was the best decade for music that we've had, while others, kind of think it's the worst. Because there's a lot of different things in there that were kind of hit or miss. Some people like, some people maybe don't like as much. Um, but, at the end of the day, it's really an interesting period. Okay, so one of the things that we see happen commonplace with music during the 1980s is really the embracing of new sounds and new trends uh, in this decade. It's something else that make the 80s really stand out in terms of music because the sound is unlike sounds that come like the sound of the 70s and the 90s and the 60s are very different than the sound of the 1980s. 1980s music, really across the board, has a much more positive vibe to it, higher pace music. The sound is faster. Um, a lot of the songs tended to focus on more positive things and were less, I don't know if you want to say socially destructive or whatever. Now, there still was some of that in the 1980s, and we'll talk about that too. But we see a lot of new and different sounds that people, again, either liked or really didn't like. Some people think it's great, other people think it's terrible. Um, we see more subgenres of rock music emerge during the 1980s. You're talking about synth pop music, um, harder rock. Light rock takes a newer form with a lot of singers singing ballads and love songs and things of that nature. Hair metal, heavy metal. Uh, so you see a lot of differentiation, a lot of different things come out of music, rock music during the 1980s. We see rap and hip hop music grow in popularity throughout the 1980s. Um, most notably, on the East Coast. East Coast rap during the 1980s is kind of where most of the big groups kind of came from, and that evolved significantly throughout the decade as well. Early on, it had a lot of a disco vibe to it or a funk vibe to it. As the decade wore on, we saw rap groups embrace kind of new notions of their sound, doing a lot of covers of older songs, often from the 70s and before, of like some old disco or funk songs. And then late in the 80s, you see the emergence of the West Coast rap scene and gangster rap. So if any music kind of embraced forms of protest or anything like that during the 1980s, um, rap or hip hop would be your best example of that. Some of the most popular voices during the 1980s came from female pop singers. As they would become louder, they become more expressive. They would sing about more things. And one thing that was really unique, we listened to an example from the 70s on I Am Woman, a song by a female singer, but the music is, as a pop song by Helen Reddy there, is directed primarily towards a female audience. One of the things about female pop singers in the 80s is, yes, they'd be very, very popular with girls, but it was pop music, so it was genuinely embraced by a lot of men as well. We're talking about artists like Madonna, Cyndi Lauper, people like that. You also see the emergence of really your first all-female rock groups in the 1980s. Groups like the Go-Go's, the Bangles, um, singers like that. Now, it's not new that music and rock music particularly would have female singers, but it was fairly uncommon to see pop groups that were comprised only of women. So this was something that was a big change, a big sea change in music during the 1980s. But you have a lot of big female rock stars too. People like Pat Benatar, Joan Jett, and many others as the decade wears on. One of the biggest impacts, maybe the biggest impact in music in the 1980s, was the emergence of MTV. Now, MTV is very different today than what it was like in the 1980s, but it had a huge influence on music. Early on, MTV pretty much only would show music videos from various artists that were popular at a particular time. And if you could get a music video that you made on MTV, especially in the early years where they didn't have much of a selection, you would get a lot of airplay, and it'd be a great way to sell records. Because now people could not only listen to the music, but they could also see a story that goes along with it. You would also see, um, um, what the members of the band looked like, so you'd be able to put kind of a face more to the music, which was a big influence there. Uh, so MTV is a huge impact. And the interesting thing about music videos during this time is, as people were experimenting with different looks and styles and types of their music videos, some would be very theatrical. There's some of the examples that you'll be looking at in the music I sent you are very theatrical versions of music videos of songs. Other groups would do, simply just a video of their band singing the song in front of an audience on a stage or something like that. Others would try some other strange practices and things. Uh, and one of the interesting things about MTV on top of that would be if you really made a great video for an average song, it would make that song much more popular. And then on the flip side of that, if you made like a really horrible video, which happened often, just weird and awkward, a really awkward video to a really great song, that can negatively impact the popularity of of the music. But groups that really embraced MTV in the 1980s would be groups like Michael Jackson for sure, Duran Duran, a synth pop group. Um, Madonna would do a lot of videos. You see hers are very theatrical, as are Michael Jackson's. And these are extremely popular and have huge influence on music during the time period. Uh, the biggest star, really not arguably, the biggest star of the 1980s, without question, is Michael Jackson. Not only does he make music that is true pop music that everybody embraces and everybody likes, whether you're black, white, male, female, whatever, everybody likes Michael Jackson and his music. You also have him make these videos that are, again, very theatrical, big productions. Sometimes they'd have other stars and famous people that would participate in making the video, especially as the decade wore on. Uh, and it would be a big event when a new Michael Jackson video would premiere because so much money and so much went into it. And then, Michael would show off his dance moves and new things that he's trying, and new dance moves that he's tried, like the moonwalk or the anti-gravity move or whatever it is, the robot. So he would do these things in the videos, and this is probably among the stuff that gets the most airplay on MTV. Now, I said one thing that you didn't hear as much of, you didn't see as much of in the 1980s, by the 1980s, was protest music. Okay, there wasn't a lot of protest music in the 1980s because there was no Vietnam that was going on anymore. The civil rights movement had kind of slowed. So the 1980s is not a decade filled with a lot of music with political themes or anti-war themes or anything like that. Now, I did give you a couple examples of songs that do have a little bit of that, but you don't see much of it in the 1980s. What it's replaced with in 1980s is something that we call cause music. Uh, this is music made where maybe large groups of performers would get together and record a song. The most classic example of this is "We Are the World" in 1985 with Michael Jackson and Bruce Springsteen and Huey Lewis and Diana Ross and just about every big name you could think of in pop music during that time. Um, and Do They Know It's Christmas? It was a bunch of popular British singers like George Michael and Wham and Queen and other groups that were a part of that. Uh, and typically, when I say cause, this music is created meant to raise money for, some sort of significant cause, whether it's, like We Are the World was to help feed hungry people in Africa. There was a massive concert that kind of took place simultaneously in the United States and in England on the same day called Live Aid, which was to bring attention to the AIDS virus. If you've seen the movie Bohemian Rhapsody, uh, the song that Queen, the performance that Queen has had at the end of that is the kind of their iconic performance at Live Aid in 1985. Country music stars had a Farm Aid uh, cause concert in the 1980s where they raised money for poor farmers in the country. And this was led by all these country stars. Willie Nelson created that. So you see music shift from trying to make political statements or protest statements to using their platform to speak up for causes and make a difference in the world in that respect. So some of the popular genres from the 80s. Now you have new wave or synth pop music. It's kind of the same thing. Some of the prominent groups in this particular area were Duran Duran. You have an example of their music in your assignment this week, and Tears for Fears. Same with them. Uh, this is rock music with a little less harsher sound that integrates more synthesizers and different different beats and synchronizations into their music to kind of create this new sound, this new wave fusion of a little bit. It's a little bit of rock, a little bit of classic rock, a little bit of punk, a little bit of disco-y, edgy types music that goes into popularizing this new wave style during the 80s. Duran Duran's one of the most popular bands of the decade. Tears for Fears has a few big hits in the mid 80s. Depeche Mode is also very popular. Pop music stars in the 1980s. These are all names we should be familiar with. In the early 80s, it's dominated by people like Michael Jackson, who of course been around since the 70s with the Jackson 5, but branches off on his own in 1979, and in 1982 releases Thriller, which is like the top-selling album of all time, and a few years later, in 1987, releases Bad, which is another one of the top-selling albums of the decade and of all time, for that matter. Madonna releases several. She comes out in 1982, and she releases several big records during the 1980s. She's a crossover star. She was so popular that because of her singing, she had a few movie roles as well, and has been an actress on and off at various times since that point. Cyndi Lauper is another example of a popular female pop star. Girls Just Want to Have Fun, Time After Time, were among some of her big hits in the mid 80s. In the late 80s, as some of these, female stars are getting older and experimenting more with their music, Debbie Gibson is another popular one that emerges. She is kind of like a Britney Spears-ish type version in the 1980s. Her music ultimately would be less controversial than some of the songs Madonna would go on to make later in the decade, and would be fun, poppy songs that anybody could listen to. I mentioned before, all female led bands like the Go-Go's and the Bangles were really popular during the 1980s. We Got the Beat or Vacation were two songs by the Go-Go's. Uh, they eventually broke up in like 1984, and some of them, like Belinda Carlisle was their lead singer. She went on to a very successful solo career. And then you have Prince. Prince, of course, is one of the biggest stars ever and one of the biggest stars of the 1980s. Um, and he's a very unique musician. He's not somebody that you can kind of pin into one genre or one style of music because Prince's songs were such a fusion again of all these different styles that whenever you hear a song by Prince, it has a unique sound to it that makes it uniquely, it's Prince when he's on. But he's a massively popular artist uh, and also receives ton of critical acclaim for his skills as a musician and singer, but also as a performer and writer of songs as well. Another movement we see happen big time in the 1980s was the profusion of what we call hair metal or heavy metal music. We saw some examples of this in the 1970s, some of the stuff Led Zeppelin did, Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath, even bands like Kiss and others really have a metalish edge to them, but it really blows up during the 1980s with these big hair bands. And those are groups like that you see first emerge in the 80s, groups like Bon Jovi, Van Halen, Motley Crue, Guns N' Roses. Of course, their popularity would grow even more so in the 1990s. Uh, you know, this hair metal music had a kind of a subculture to it where the performers, were known for being really like crazy and going out and doing, crazy things. If you've ever seen the Dirt, the Motley Crue movie, you can see some of that in there. They were probably the most notorious of any group. Um, but they were hard partying. The music could be very harsh and fast paced, but also, especially with groups like Van Halen and Bon Jovi, have a really positive vibe to it in a certain extent. An example would be Dreams by Van Halen or Living on a Prayer music by Bon Jovi, which were two of the most popular hair metal band songs of the 1980s that really stood out um, during that time. So, some of these groups are still performing today. All four of them, not coming out with a ton of new stuff. Bon Jovi comes out with new albums here and there, but these groups largely still perform today. Some of their old hits and things like that. So they're all still around. Um, the problem with heavy metal in the 1980s or hair metal is there would be such a saturation of groups that would jump into this genre that we had so many of them that when the 1990s hit, it was almost overnight, especially when the grunge music kind of came. And we'll talk about that when we get to the 90s. When grunge music hit, these hair bands died out overnight. And unless you were one of the really, really well established groups, like the ones here, or like Metallica or somebody like that, a lot of these groups would break up, and that'd be the end. It was really almost like a hard stop to that style of music. We see rap music emerge. First on the East Coast, groups like Run DMC and Public Enemy, Eric B. and Rakim, Curtis Blow was kind of one of the first innovators of rap music. He was the first rap artist ever to release a rap single that went gold, a song called "The Message," uh, and that was, again, another groundbreaking moment in rap or hip hop music. But we see kind of the beginnings of the East Coast West Coast feud that would really grow during the 1990s in rap music. On the East Coast, you have, again, groups like Run DMC and Public Enemy, and then NWA out of South Central Los Angeles originates the gangster rap genre of really angry music, angry rap, and talking about, the limits on African Americans' place in society and um, what they can and can't do, and obviously the restrictions put on them by the police and and things of that nature. So you got a couple examples from those groups in there. When you're looking for how are they protesting, the biggest protest anthem is actually probably um, not from NWA, is probably Fight the Power, which you'll be listening to in your assignment this week as well. Okay. I mentioned also kind of regular rock and roll music or soft rock. Some of the biggest names in that in the 1980s are Bruce Springsteen. Phil Collins might be the biggest name. He has a ton of hits, probably a lot of, again, popular songs that you're familiar with. You might not know it's Phil Collins, but he's a big name in music during the 1980s and comes up with tons of music. Famously, during that Live Aid concert in 1985, uh, he performed in London in the morning, and then took a plane across the ocean to perform in the U.S. version of Live Aid that evening. So that was kind of like a big deal, and he was a huge star. Uh, the song Land of Confusion that you're listening to on the assignment this week is from him. Born in the USA, of course, from Springsteen. Then you have Billy Joel and Elton John, who are holdovers from the 1970s, but also produced some of their best work during the 1980s. So you see a lot of these softer rock singers, poppy singers that are really, really popular during the 1980s. Billy Joel, Elton John, Phil Collins, etc., and many other groups that maintained during that time as well. Another example of that would be somebody like a Huey Lewis. Power to Love and many other songs were really popular from him. His group in the mid 1980s, he just recently retired. You got hair metal bands like Bon Jovi and Motley Crue here, Duran Duran, kind of that new wave. You can also see kind of the fashion stylings during that period and how they were doing. You got the big hair, it's like Whitney Houston down here, Run DMC, Madonna with her, fashion trends and everything. A lot of girls dressing to be like her. You also see the big hair and all that stuff. And of course, you got Michael Jackson and Prince, two of the biggest stars of the decade, and Phil Collins down here. This is one of the popular all-female groups, the Bangles. Them and the Go-Go's were two of the first ever all-female groups. So anyway, that's music in the 1980s. Remember that assignment is due on Friday, and we'll talk a little bit about all this stuff during our Zoom conference tomorrow. All right? Talk to you later. See you.